Salonika Jews had developed their own reputation. Mainly because Greeks are contentious, they're not quiet, they're individuals, and they'll complain. So the Salonika Jews, of course, were Greeks. They complained. Germans beat them up when they refused to acknowledge that they understood the orders in German, and they swore that nobody would indicate that he understood any German. And they marched around the camp all by themselves. But that's one group. The others, of course, were with the various skills that they had, because they're all basically workmen. And the Salonika stevedores, some 3,000 of them, were sent to one of the outside camps. Auschwitz had a whole series of subcamps, 39 subcamps, I think, and to open up coal mines. And once the mines were opened up, then they brought in the Polish coal miners to work them. Of those 3,000, I think the figure is somewhat less than 20 that survived the war. So they were decimated. And the women, of course, had their own problems in the camps. And one day, some 450 of them were lined up and put on trucks and sent to the crematorium. So got to get rid of them to get new people to come in. Some of them, because they spoke German, so a number of Greek Jews spoke German. German Jews who had married Greeks or who had learned it in various ways, including some of the men, acted as interpreters and managed to survive in various ways, which is why of the ultimately 65,000 that are estimated to have gone to Auschwitz, only 2,000, or less than 2,000, returned. Others were taken out to Sweden during the last days of the war, and various other ways they succeeded in surviving. Many of them were sent, and the later transports were sent to subcamps and work camps throughout Germany, and never even experienced a day of Auschwitz, because immediately when they were entered, they had to go into quarantine. And therefore they never experienced the camp. And they were sent out to one of these subcamps as such. All right, so now let's turn about the resistance. One can define resistance from the basis of survival in a place where you were only allowed 3 weeks to live before you died, and you were helped along during those 3 weeks, to actual physical survival, physical revolt. So the survival stories we have are extremely fascinating. Greeks were, 2 Greek boxers succeeded in saving their lives by winning all the battles that the Germans pitted them against other Jews, such as the North African boxing champ who was Jewish, and they just had them fight each other. They made a movie about that, big controversy over the movie, which we won't go into. But in any event, we know his story. And the women, of course, had their resistance. They would make up songs in Greek or Judeo-Spanish in which they would tell the news to the men by singing as they walked along going out to work, doing all the terrible work that they did in various commandos. And they would just sing these songs, and then the news would go through the entire camp of who lived, who died, whose brother to say hello to, etc., etc. One of the nastiest stories of Birkenau is the history of the Sonderkommandos. The Sonderkommandos really was the special commando that was responsible for getting rid of the bodies that were gassed, 2,000 at a time. such that at Auschwitz in its heyday was able to consume 10,000 Jews a day. A day. This is why we get ultimately to the figure of a little over 1 million, 1.25 million that were killed in Auschwitz. That's the latest figures. So their job was to shepherd the people into the gas chambers, collect the clothes, and send them off to the Canada Commando, and then after the people were killed, to haul out the bodies and send them upstairs to the crematorium. Now the Germans, in order to have the system work efficiently, wiped out the Sonderkommando after 3 months, except for a skeleton crew, so that they would train the new people that were brought in off the trains. Why 3 months? Well, by that time, people had gotten, or the young men who were drafted for this, basically young, strong teenagers we're talking about, who had no discipline, no experience, and were scared witless, basically, pulled off the trains and sent off to the crematorium to be indoctrinated. How did they indoctrinate them? They would put them in the quarters and give them endless supplies of liquor, and teenagers and drinking. We know that from undergraduates, they binge drink. So these guys were basically drunk all the time. And then they would take them out for small jobs like mopping the floor, sorting the clothes, or sending the clothes over, cleaning up, if you will, the chambers after the people had gone out and leaving all what people dying violently tend to do. And then sending them upstairs to work in the crematoria itself, that is putting the bodies into the ovens, which was a highly sophisticated technique that was developed by the T4 people in order to make it more efficient. So 3 months they figured was about enough, and then they would wipe them out and take in a new group. So when the train came, they would draft out enough for the to replace the ones that were killed, and they would wind up burning their own families, which was also sending these guys into Never Never Land, absolute psychic shocks that, at least amongst the Greeks, we have the stories of people who just threw themselves into the fire pits during the summer of '44 because they just couldn't handle burning people alive. So they jumped in themselves and died, or watching them being shot and falling into the fire pits. So, I mean, all this, we're talking about really horror stories. In fact, most of them wound up being psychologist patients, really, for much of their lives afterwards. So in any event, the 11th Sonderkommando was the one that was drawn out of the one of the last Greek transports. And there are two stories that come out of that. One is the refusal of some 400 young Greek Jews to serve in the Sonderkommando when it was explained to them. Absolutely refused. And they were threatened that they would be killed. They said, nope, we won't do it. So they were killed. But apparently the story, as it's reported by one of the surviving nurses, made a great impression on the camp, but we haven't found too many supports for the story, but it's entirely possible, since the Greeks, after all, invented the phrase freedom and death, or freedom or death, depending on how you recall it. The other is the Greeks, basically from Western Greece, and these were Romaniot Greeks, from Yanina, from the province of Akarnania, and in the south. They were the main Greek force that was drafted into the Sonderkommando, along with other ethnic groups, and later Hungarians from the trains that were coming in were added to it. And there had been long-term plans for a revolt. Now, one of the key factors in the revolts that took place in the camps was the appearance there of officers, army officers. Because how else are you going to organize a these teenage kids, or young guys. How are you going to organize them? You need a coach to make a basketball team win. And we're watching that now in this crazy tournament. And you can do this because they're malleable. So the fact is that most of the Greeks were individualistic and functioned individualistically and survived within their own groups, but by themselves, basically. Here, you need a reserve officer. So in Treblinka, the arrival of Jewish officers. In Sobibor, the arrival of Jewish officers. And in Auschwitz, even the arrival of the Russians didn't make a difference, although they themselves were under their own leadership, but there were only a handful of them. And by the way, everybody asks, why did these people go to their death like sheep to the slaughter? Which is a phrase that was was first uttered to Abu Kovner by a Soviet officer. Said, why do your people go like sheep to the slaughter? That's when Kovner responded by saying, we shall not go like sheep to the slaughter, quoting Yosipon. Or however he picked it up in the 1,000-year literary tradition that repeated it. So when the officers came in, alongside the communist resistance movement, which was very, very strong in most camps, they basically took over the administration of the camps in terms of the organization of the prisoners. And they, so the communists were basically Polish communists and other communists, but mainly Polish communists, because they were the first in, and they had the lowest numbers, so they were the real kings, if you will. And the general Birkenau camp resistance, which was made up of Jews, but I mean these guys were just absolutely beaten into submission, who really couldn't provide any leadership, but could organize at least if the revolt ever broke out. And the Sonderkommando, which was the only healthy, strong people available amongst Jews, because they were all young teenagers who were eating all the goodies that were brought in on the trains and drinking all the booze that was brought in and collecting all the medicine that people had on in their pockets that they then passed on to the infirmaries. So the plan was that the Sonderkommando would begin the revolt, the Polish communists and the people that they had organized would pick it up, and the general Jewish mass would join, and everybody would run out, if you will, and some would survive. As in Sobibor, I think half of the ones who escaped survived, the rest were killed in the process. I don't know the exact figures, if you know the figures of Sobibor. No, but in any event, it's about 50% of them, I think, were killed in the process. All right, so the idea was to start the revolt on August the 15th. Of course, they were all frightened by this wave of ultimately 400,000 Hungarian Jews that were sent to Auschwitz in summer of '44. And almost all of them butchered on arrival, or burned on arrival, gassed and burned. So August 15th. August 15th is a Christianization of a lovely old Jewish holiday from the Temple period, when the girls, it's kind of a Sadie Hawkins day, when all the girls would dress in white and carry wood to the temple. And the boys would look at them and then tell their parents which one they wanted to marry. And then the negotiations would begin. So the church turned this into the day of Mary's ascension. I think it is, isn't it?
Right.
Yeah.
Dormition.
The Dormition, right? Because there's a Dormition Abbey in Jerusalem. And I usually call it ascension, but it's a Dormition, in which he fell asleep and then went up to heaven. And all the gods got drunk, because it was a big holiday. So that would be a good day to revolt when all the gods were drunk. So that was planned. And just before that, the gypsy camp was emptied, just overnight. They just killed all the gypsies, including the gypsies who had fought in the German army, who were put into the camp. And they lived, really, just like a real family camp. The capo who was in charge of the Sonderkommando revolt group was betrayed by some villain, as one would say in French, and he, or Calabo in Belgian French, and he was thrown into the oven, and that was the end of the revolt for that period of time. Then, in terms of the historiography of the problem, the Greeks really give 3 different dates for the revolt. One in July, which is impossible. One in September, for which there's no proof. And the other is October the 7th, which was a Sabbath, 1944. Now, turns out that the Hungarians were all dead, except for the ones working in the Sonderkommando. So the Germans decided that they didn't need a large workforce. So what do? You lay them off. Right? Put them in a gas chamber, they lie down, they die, and you make them go away. So, so on that Sabbath, they called out the Greek numbers. Principle being the last in, the first out, in terms of being destroyed. And one of the leaders of the planning for the revolt was Joseph Baruch, spelled with a V. At least he spells it with a V, because the Greeks don't have a B. Right? They have an MP, which of course looks ugly when you write it. Right? So when he had to write it in English, or rather write it in Latin characters, when he signed in to Auschwitz, you have to sign in with your address, the languages you spoke, your military traditions, and everything. All those papers, at least from the last Sonderkommando, or the last Sonderkommando, are available in New York, in Evo, in the Center for Jewish History. They have these. Somebody managed to grab all of these papers when they left. All kinds of things survived, as opposed to the things that didn't survive because the Germans were ordered to destroy them. So on the top of this pile is a list of about 30 people, Greeks, who signed in, all with military training. And so Baruch, who was who was an active army officer, and had also been in the resistance, was now in Auschwitz, right? And he was part of the planning for the revolt, because he was a fighting officer. Right? So he called out to the men and says, "Up and at 'em," which is exactly what Greek officers said to their men when they led the charge. So they revolted. The revolt didn't last long. The men, after the Germans came and shot a whole bunch of them, they retreated to Crematoria 3 and 4. Crematoria 3 was surrounded by the Germans and bombarded. So they did what Greeks have done in the past when they were totally surrounded by the enemy. This goes all the way back to ancient Greek literature, in which the men were taught that when you're surrounded by the enemy and they're about to capture you and make you and your wives slaves, you kill your family, you burn everything so there's no loot, and then you commit suicide. Right? We have this in any number of Greek sources. So this is what they did. They burned the place, and then they blew it up, just like the Greek combatants did at the beginning of the Greek War of Independence back in 1820. Just blew it up. And the same with Crematorium 4. They were captured, and most of them were killed as well. So that's the story of the Greek Sonderkommando. Can I have 2 more minutes for the Warsaw story? At the beginning, in September of 1943, the Warsaw Ghetto had been destroyed in Passover of 1943, and the place was just a huge acres and acres of desolation. Plus the fact that there were many Jews hiding in the dugouts and caves and tunnels that they built underneath this. So the Germans from Auschwitz drafted thousands of prisoners, including and it's difficult. There were about 3 trainloads of Greek prisoners, and we don't know exactly how many. Could have been anywhere from 1,200 to 2,500 that were sent to Warsaw, along with Dutch. Anybody who couldn't speak Polish, right, or German, was sent there. So they went to there and they began to recycle all the bricks. And we're talking about acres and acres and acres of buildings that had been destroyed. And they opened bunkers, and all the money had to be given to the Germans, et cetera, et cetera. And they did this really until June of 1944. And they even celebrated Passover and made matzahs in Poland during this slave period. Then the Germans began their retreat from Poland in July of 1944. And that's another horrible story. But the revolt broke out, General Komarovsky's revolt broke out in August of 44, because they believed that since Stalin's men were just outside of Poland, across the Vistula, they would get some help. But of course Stalin had different plans. He figured that the Polish intellectuals would kill a few Germans, and the Germans would kill a whole bunch of Polish intellectuals, and therefore he'd be able to take over without any opposition. So they sat and waited for a while. They did the same thing in Lodz. And there were 77,000 Jews in Lodz in the summer of 1944. And the Soviet army waited until almost all of them were sent to Auschwitz. So anyway, this, if you will, the korbanot, as they say in Hebrew, sacrifices for expediency and other reasons. So when they broke out, Greek Jews who were left, probably about 100 or 150 or so, that were left out of the thousands who had been sent back to Dachau in July of 1944. It's another story. And they immediately joined the fighters. So they were able to fight against the Nazis, whether they were Ukrainian soldiers or German soldiers or whoever was guarding them and occupying Warsaw, and against the Polish anti-Semites who didn't like Jews. But the military experience was of tremendous assistance, both in terms of organization. They split up into groups so they all wouldn't be killed at the same time, or some might survive and be able to tell the story. A couple of them did. The resistance, or not the resistance, but the revolutionaries captured a tank. Now, who in Poland, in the university, can run a tank? A veteran can run a tank. Who can fire a howitzer? They don't learn that in the humanities. So all of these military skills that they had, they successfully were able to employ and contribute, as well as basic medical assistance, because soldiers were in field dressings and others, and schlepping water to other fighters. And ultimately 27 survived in that Warsaw story. And in fact, they even made a Greek flag and waved it. So to sum up, in 1944, we have 3 episodes of Greek resistance, many of them by Romaniot Jews, against the Axis. One was in Greece, the Andantes, who were part of the train busting forces. And in fact, several of the people, which we don't have time to talk about, actually led units, both women and men, fighting units. And so that was in Greece. And they slaughtered the Germans as they retreated. In Auschwitz, during the Sonderkommando uprising, and in Poland, during the Polish uprising. And that's their legacy. Thank you. More water for me.
Comments?
What a nice story.
No.
This is really mundane in the context of everything, but I noticed that nowadays the city's Thessaloniki. So who uses Salonika, who uses Thessaloniki?
Well, Thessaloniki was named by Alexander for his sister.
So it's always been that.
But the Jews, they didn't need the Thessaloniki. So they called it Salonika, or shortened it to Saloniki because they're Greek speaking. But Salonika is in all of the Hebrew documents from the 16th century on. And even in Geniza letters from the 11th and 12th century, it was always known as Salonika by the Jews. It was just too long to have the whole thing, and a mouthful. Be fun to talk about Greek and Hebrew as languages.
Yes.
And their influence on each other.
They can handle the transliteration.
Can I ask you what your reaction was and appraisal was of Claude Langeman's Shoah, which I think for the first time in the United States put Greek Jews in the Holocaust on the screen?
Mm-hmm. I'm probably the only one who saw it all 9 hours twice. Found it incredibly boring until I began to understand what he did. It was basically an existential film. I was happy to see all these Greeks in there. I mean, I interviewed some of them, and I've read their memoir. It was good to have this story publicly told in a public, broad public reception. And that was good, because even the Yiddish-speaking Jews in Birkenau never really accepted the Salonika Jews because they couldn't speak Yiddish. And when the girls from Rhodes, women, no, they were girls who were brought into the camp, from Rhodes were brought into the camp, they were treated very badly by the other girls, and until they recited the Hebrew prayers. Then they realized they were Jewish. What kind of Jews? Can't speak Yiddish. So this is one of the main gripes that the Greek Jews have against the other Jews, in that they were not part of it. I met one Greek woman, in Seattle, a Sephardi, and she was absolutely amazing. She said she never uttered a word in the camp. She walked around like a lost kitten until she was adopted by 4 Bulvan, guards on a football team, women. And she just trailed behind them for days and weeks, and they sort of protected her, but never said a word. And then one day, they went to the left, she went to the right, and she never saw them again, because they were sent off to a gas chamber. Luck. Survival was 90% luck, and 10% tichia, the Greeks would call it, but the Jews who survived would call it God's will. But 90% of it was luck, and maybe 10% was the various skills that one had, either linguistic or technical. And they all acknowledge that. Now, the lady at the auction place said, all done?
No,
Thank
you
You
very
knitted a
much.
beautiful story tonight,
Thank you.
some of which I was familiar with. It's surprising from my parents and traveling